Hey, good morning, First Baptist. It's good to be here this morning. I got my coffee, I have the Word, and just got through reading and thinking about 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And of course, if you're reading this book, and particularly chapter 10, you find that Paul's defending himself and his ministry, particularly the letter that he wrote before to the church, and that would be 1 Corinthians, which was a rather harsh letter. He was very bold in his letter, in his rebuke, because there was, quite frankly, false teaching, and that led to really terrible practices that were taking place in that church that needed to be addressed. And there was a rumor going around, or at least some were slandering Paul and saying that he's bold in his letters, but in person he's weak. And certainly they were trying to destroy what was happening there with his ministry. And so he's defending himself. And basically, his argument in this particular chapter is that we're not going to be ashamed for standing up for truth within the church. The church of all places should have truth. It should be the place where truth is loud and clear, and so false teaching is a big deal. And so he's addressing false teaching. I want to read verses 4, 5, and 6, and just kind of give you a quick thought on those verses. It says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete." And so as Paul is addressing this issue of, hey, we're not going to back down from addressing false teaching that's leading to dishonorable practices, false practices. And so let's look at this idea of false teaching. These are ideas or teachings that are rooted in the opinion of people and taught to those in the church. We're not talking about false teaching outside the church. We're talking about false teaching within the church. And these are man's opinions that set themselves up against what God has already said and clear about. And I'm not talking about little doctrinal differences that the church has debated for years and years and years. I'm talking about these major ideas and concepts that go completely against the knowledge of God. They're anti-gospel. They just don't fit in the church. And Paul calls them strongholds because that's what they are. They will destroy a church, and they will infiltrate a church and lock it up. And yet Paul says that in his ministry, he knows that this is a war, but his power is not of himself. It's divine power to destroy these strongholds. And so he's not going to let these false teachings go unchecked, because this is spiritual warfare happening. And so he is going to not let them go unchecked. He's going to confront them because they're strongholds, and the Spirit of God can destroy those, and they need to be destroyed. If you read this chapter, it is obvious that even in verse 6, where he talks about being ready to punish every disobedience, in some ways, in a time where we talk about grace, that may seem kind of harsh. Like, where's the grace in that, Paul? But the reality is that if you let false teaching go unchecked in the church, it will destroy the church. This is serious business. And so Paul addresses that. False teaching needs to be destroyed, needs to be snuffed out, and that is what he is referring to in terms of punish every disobedience. And I want to draw attention to one last thing, and that is when these ideas are, you hear ideas, opinions from people about what God says, you need to take that thought captive and then make it obedient to Christ. In other words, is it really God's thoughts? Has God spoken on this and been clear? Because we like to speak for God a lot. And so I would just encourage you to take those thoughts captive, make them obedient to Christ. What has God said about this? Because when we begin to understand truth, we begin to realize that the truth will actually be the thing that destroys these lies that the enemy is trying to get us to fall into. And so this is what Paul's doing here. He's defending his ministry and saying, listen, false teaching has to be challenged. It cannot go unchecked. It's too important. It will destroy the church. So I would encourage you just to be a person who is in the Word. You can't know what God says unless you're in the Word. And then you take those thoughts captive, make them obedient to Christ, and we will, together by God's help, with His in His divine power, destroy those strongholds, not only in their church but in our lives that Satan has, just kind of locked in there and keeping us from honoring God, not only in our actions but in our thinking as well. Blessings.